things reproducing after their kind, that scientific law has never ever been broken, and yet sadly it's been deleted from many textbooks and replaced with a new theory called abiogenesis, the idea of maybe there's some self-replicating genes out there that could have given rise spontaneously to life that then evolved to the modern forms we have today. So how sad is it that we've replaced a scientific law with a theory that has absolutely no basis in scientific data?
You mentioned something in your answer a minute ago that we'll kind of transition into. You used the word mutate.
Yes, yes.
And the evolutionist has basically a threefold formula for macroevolution to have occurred, for things to change from one kind of something to another.
Yes.
And one of those is mutations. The other, begins with the concept of natural selection.
Survival of the fittest.
Darwin's theory, and then you add mutations, helpful mutations, and then what, as we've talked about in previous lessons, what the evolutionist needs in everything is a lot of time.
Right.
If you put those three together, you get macroevolution. Why don't you talk to us about these three things: natural selection, mutations, time.
If we start with natural selection, the easiest way to think about it is simply survival of the fittest. You ask the question, okay, which one are the fittest? It's the ones that survive. Which ones survive? It's the fittest. So you've got a circular tautology that really, if you analyze it, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, understand that creationists, we don't have a problem with natural selection. In fact, it was a creationist named Edward Blythe who actually came up with the original concept before Charles Darwin did. We recognize that natural selection can be used to weed out some of the unfit. In fact, I suspect that was God's original plan for the sick, the unhealthy animals. That was a way of weeding those out of the gene pool. But we do have a problem with somebody saying that explains how everything arrived in the first place. Yes, it may explain survival of the fittest, but it doesn't explain arrival of the fittest. That's a different step. In order to make that step, evolutionists would contend that mutations, specifically beneficial mutations, have given enough genetic material in order for animals to change from one species to the next. The problem? I can only count with on my one hand maybe 2 or 3 beneficial mutations that exist. There's just not that many out there. Now we have lots of mutations, lots of negative ones. In fact, a lot of times the negative ones will kill an animal or a particular creature. We also have some a few neutral mutations that don't really harm or help the individual or the creature. We have a very scant few beneficial. Now think about how many beneficial mutations it would take to, say, go from a scale to a feather or from an arm to a wing. And yet bear in mind, mutations do not add raw genetic material. So when you have a mutation, you're not adding genetic material to the genome. So how do you go from, say, a fish that is using gills to respire to a land-dwelling creature? And bear in mind, you got to have a male and a female that are experiencing these mutations at the same time. Because it does you no good to have a fish evolve out onto the land. You've got to have a mate that it can then reproduce with to produce offspring. Natural selection does occur, but it doesn't explain how we go from one creature to the next. Beneficial mutations are just far, far too rare. I think an honest scientist, when they evaluate the evidence, will admit that. And folks, you can take as much time as you want, and it's not going to change the truth that we have never seen one species evolve into another. When you really look at the formula for evolution, you realize it doesn't get you anywhere.
It doesn't, but that's, if you have a worldview that does not include the divine, does not include God, you have to have some mechanism to get a world that doesn't have life in it to have life. And so if you start with a predisposition that God is out, this is what you're left with. You're left with a theory that when analyzed is really pretty pitiful.
Yep. Yep.
So let's turn now, and we're going to kind of take a little bit different direction, but it's connected. But we wanted to get this in this series of lessons, and that has to do with the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are often pointed to by evolutionists as evidence for evolution, as evidence for natural selection. That they couldn't live after whatever their theory is, if it was a meteorite or whatever.
It is the sugar stick candy that they give our kids.
Yeah. Let's start with the simplest question. Did dinosaurs actually exist? And if so, what do we know about them?
Yeah, we know for sure they definitely did exist. We have found their fossilized remains on all 7 continents, Arctic to Antarctic and everywhere in between. So it doesn't do us any good to simply stick our heads in the sand and say, no, dinosaurs didn't exist. The real question is, when did they exist? Was it millions and millions of years ago, as we have been indoctrinated to believe, or did they coexist with man? You see, Genesis chapter 1 tells us all land-dwelling creatures were created on day 6. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the day-age theory and the idea that these days were actually 24-hour days. They weren't millions of years long. If this was a 24-hour day and all land-dwelling creatures, including man, was created on day 6, the furthest amount of time that the dinosaurs could have been separated from humans was maybe 23 hours. When you start to evaluate the scientific evidence, there's a lot of good, solid stuff out there that proves, yes, we did coexist.
One of the things that often comes up as well in this discussion about dinosaurs is the matter of the Bible. And people say, well, if dinosaurs existed,
why aren't they mentioned in the Bible?
Exactly.
It's not really a fair question, because if you think about the word dinosaur itself was not coined until the year roughly 1845. A fellow by the name of Sir Richard Owen came up with the term. Our Bibles were translated into English, at least the King James Version was translated in 1611. Now, how do you get a word in a book that's translated in 1611 when that word doesn't come along until 1845? Roughly 250 years later. A better question would be, is there compelling evidence of dinosaur-like creatures in God's Word? And to that, Eddie, I would say turn to the book of Job. If you look in the book of Job, in Job chapter 40 and chapter 41, we're introduced to 2 creatures, the behemoth, the Leviathan, that sound an awful lot like what we today would describe as dinosaurs or dragons. Talks about this thing having a tail like a cedar. Now, ironically, it's in this section of the Bible, in this section of Job, that God is questioning Job. He's saying, how did I make this? How did I do this? He asked him questions about things like, how do the eagles fly? Where's the dwelling place of light? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? How do I make snow and hail? And then he turns to these 2 amazing creatures, and he asks Job about them.
And, you look at the descriptions of these creatures, and you get an idea that though some people will, for instance, say that the behemoth, was like a hippo or something like that, elephant, but you look at the description, and while there may be some things that you could say are similar, there are clearly some things that are not. He eats grass like an ox. This is Job 40, verse 15 and following. See now his strength is in his hips, his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. The mountains yield food for him.